this video, you're going to be learning how to make a mold using silicone putty, how to create a sculpted look using crystal clay, how to mix Nunn Design Resin and colorize it with casting craft opaque pigments, and how to put it on top to create this great look. For this tutorial, you'll need the following items. If you're using them from your kit, you'll have your Easy Mold Putty, Part A and Part B. If you purchase them in the full packs, they'll look like this. You will also need to have your crystal clay, and you will need to have your Nunn Design Resin and your colorants. For the colorants, you can use up the pigments that are in your kit, these three right here. And you will also need some sort of item that you create your impression with, whether it be a button or a fossil or an item that has a lot of dimensional detail like you're seeing here. For this tutorial, we'll be using the open back bezels. Go ahead and pull those out. The Nunn Design bezels, these are brass, and then they're plated with 24 karat gold, and the silver is plated with sterling, and then we oxidize them to give them this aged look. You'll want to go ahead and get a little bit of the rubbing alcohol onto a Q-tip and clean thoroughly the bezels. It's the oxidization after we plate them with the 24 karat gold or the fine silver. We oxidize them and to give them this aged look, and that oxidization can come off or discolor the resin. So we're cleaning them thoroughly to remove any of the oxidization that is on there, mostly where we're concerned that it'll be touching the resin. Like this upside lip right here, along here, where I often drag my resin over to the edges. I like to clean that really well. And then once you use your Q-tip, go ahead and grab a wet wipe and just wipe them down thoroughly. And just remove any of the oxidation from the surface areas. Once that is done, you can set those aside, and the next step that we're going to be doing is mixing our silicone putty. So I've already pulled the equal size balls of Part A and Part B, and I have that ready to go. Other things that I'm going to need to have ready to go is I'm going to make this impression of a fossil into my clay. So before I get started mixing my resin, I'm going to go ahead. I have a little bit of olive oil, and I'm going to put that onto a Q-tip and rub it all over the item that I'm going to be embedding into the molding putty. This will just help this fossil release very easily from the putty, and I won't have any bits sticking to my fossil and not making a nice clean impression. Alright, so now that's oiled all up and that's ready to go. Other things that I like to have on the ready are, I like to have a flat surface that I'm going to be pressing down into the silicone putty so I can get a nice flat patty. If you don't have a flat dish, you can also use the top of the silicone putty. The silicone putty, you have to work very fast with this. This is Part A and Part B, equal size balls. You have approximately it's up to 2 minutes, but I like to work really fast with this because I've had it set up as little as 45 seconds from time to time. So the ideal with this is to blend it very thoroughly until it is no longer marbled. and you just mix it. I like to use my fingertips at first to really get in there and knead this very thoroughly, making sure that I have no parts of it that are not being blended together fully. And then once I'm seeing and turning and flipping it over and seeing that I have no marbling going on, I'm going to roll it into a nice tight ball that's hopefully very smooth and without any kind of creases. All right, if I have some creases, I will put that flat side down because I want to have my top part where I'm making my impression be nice and smooth. And this is where I'm going to take the top of my glass dish and I'm going to press down, making a nice flat patty that is approximately that thick because my fossil is fairly thick. I'm going to release it off of the glass dish, and then I'm going to press in my fossil into the molding putty. So I'm pressing it all the way down until it's fully down in there. And before it gets too set, I'm going to grab one of my bezels that I've already cleaned. I'm going to bend this back and release it, place it back down, and then I'm going to decide where does my design look the best for me to press in. I'm going to say right there. And now I'm pressing down. My bezel into the molding putty. What that'll allow me to do is every single time I make an impression from here on out, I can put this bezel right into this setting. It'll have like a little registration mark up here, and then I will be able to have a perfect registration every time. So this will take about 20 minutes for this to set up, and while we're letting that set up, we'll go ahead and do our next step with mixing the crystal clay. The next step is going to be using the crystal clay, which is a 2-part epoxy clay, and you have 90 to 120 minutes to work with this, and it starts to harden in about 2 to 2.5 hours, but it won't be fully cured till 14 to 16 hours. So open up the pack, put on your gloves, pinch off 2 equal sized balls, and then you're going to mix these together thoroughly until they are fully blended. Once the clay is fully blended, you can take off your gloves and you will be ready for the next step. So before you get too far into the process of the next step, take a moment to go ahead and remove any of the oil and potentially any of the silicone putty from your fossil, just to keep it nice and clean. Just use a wet wipe to wipe that down. Now I think we're ready to go ahead and take a look at our mold. It is setting up very nicely. So we're going to go ahead and leave that on its little plastic. And we've already mixed also our crystal clay. And I'm going to go ahead and pinch off a small ball of the crystal clay and roll it in the palm of my hand with my finger to get a nice smooth surface. So the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to press this ball down into the clay, but before I start making that impression and pressing it down into the clay, I'm going to take a little bit of olive oil that I had on my sheet earlier from getting my fossil nice and oiled, and I'm going to put a little bit of that olive oil on my fingers. This will prevent this crystal clay from sticking to my fingers when I'm pressing it down into the mold. press that full ball in there. And now I'm pressing it out to the sides so that I can have, I'm going to zoom in here so you can see this a little better. Now I'm pressing it out to the sides. So you want to have a nice flat surface with this when you're done. If you had too much clay, you can pinch some of that off. If you didn't have enough clay, you could add some to it. But you want to have a nice smooth surface like this when you're finished. If you'd like to see what this impression looks like, you can bend this back and see how your impression came out. If you didn't like this for whatever reason, you can go ahead and pull this out, clean the bezel up, press the bezel back in to the mold and start over. I'm going to say that I didn't like this, and so I'm going to go ahead and pull this out just so I can show you the whole process of what will happen if you didn't like this and you wanted to redo it another time. So just go ahead and pull it out. This time around, I'm going to go ahead and wipe the inside of my bezel here to make sure that I don't have a lot of olive oil on there, and I'm going to clean this thoroughly to make sure that I don't have a lot of olive oil on this. What I found is if I have too much olive oil on there, it's easy for the clay not to adhere to the sides of this bezel, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to start over and I press that in there. But I knew I liked that impression, and I know that that looked good. So I press the bezel back into the place and take my clay, roll it into that nice round ball again. Actually, I think I have too much clay on this one. Roll it into the nice round ball. And press a little bit more, my fingers a little bit with that olive oil again, just a little bit. And press it into the ball now. So with that olive oil on my fingers, this clay is not sticking to my fingers at all. And if I didn't have that on there, it would totally stick on there. So make sure that you're pressing the clay down in there to get a nice impression, but that you're also really pressing it over. I'm using my finger to push this over to the sides so that it fully adheres to those edges. And then to show you on this particular one, I use some gold mica powder on the back of this piece instead of having it be just the color of the clay on the back like you would have on the surface like this. So if you want to do that, you can use a little bit, there should be plenty of the Pearl X powder pigment left over from the previous class. You'll need to have a Q-tip and smear that around. So grab a toothpick and open up the Pearl X powders. Get a little bit of that on your toothpick, on your Q-tip. And then while the clay is still wet, you're going to smear this onto the back side. When it's wet, it'll adhere onto the epoxy clay and be permanent onto that surface. The scary part about doing it this way, where I'm putting the Pearl X powders while it's still in the mold, is I don't know if that impression is going to be good. And if it wasn't, that clay would have been, if I had to pull this clay out again, I would have had silver on it, and that wouldn't have been good. But I'd already done that one previous, and I knew what the impression was going to look like. If you wanted to, you could pull this out first and then hold it with your hands and put the Pearl X powders on like this to make sure that you have the Pearl X powders on. And once you have the impression made in the mold and you have your powders on, place the bezel on a nice card that has a little bit of tape on the surface so that it doesn't stick to the actual card as it's curing, and you'll let this cure for 2 hours before you put on the colorized resin. So the next step we're going to be doing is mixing the resin. So go ahead and put a piece of plastic out, get your stir stick, your drizzle stick, and your toothpicks out, and you'll want to have one of the mixing cups. For mixing the Nunn Design Resin, you need to mix 1 tablespoon of part A to 1 tablespoon of part B. It's a 1-to-1 ratio in order for this to activate, and you have to mix the full cup. So go ahead and get your resin out, part A and part B, and you're going to start with your part A, pouring it into the 1 tablespoon mark. I'm going to do the same with the part B. I'm going to bring it up to the 2 tablespoon mark. Pour, pour, pour. When I start to get right to that line, I ease the flow, twist the top, and I'm done. Clean off the top, put on the lid, and grab a fresh wet wipe and wipe my hands down really nicely, making sure that I don't have any resin on my fingers, because I am picking up my phone and setting the timer for 2 minutes. Oops. Then with the stir stick, go in and start to stir the resin. Mix for the full 2 minutes, and even if it is, the timer goes off and it is not clear, it'll have bubbles in it, but if it's still kind of milky and you think that the 2 parts aren't blended, you'll continue to stir for a little bit longer, but it's a minimum of 2 minutes. Stopping and scraping the sides of my stir stick. And that is time. I set my stir sticks off to the side and let that cure, or you can take a wet wipe and clean them off. I use these over and over again, often scrape gooby gone off of pieces and such, so just clean that off and you'll have a nice surface for next time. Alright, and I also spilled a little bit on my plastic here, so I can just clean that up so I have a nice surface here too, wiping the side. The next step is going to be colorizing it. So colorizing the resin, and to do that I'm going to move that aside, bring in another piece of plastic, and I'm going to off pour. I'm going to do multiple colors, so I'm going to off pour this to the 1 tablespoon mark. And for my first one, I think I'm going to do him in blue. So I'm opening up the blue of the casting craft. Now this stuff is so incredibly impotent, you only need a tiny, tiny bit in order to colorize that whole batch. So just get a tiny bit on your toothpick and smear it inside of there, and then let's see how we did. And put the top back on. I'm pretty sure I'm going to have enough, but I might need more. It's a very, very faint, light, pale blue. And if I wanted to test what that looked like, I could either put it on if I had some extra crystal clay, like here's some other pieces I did. If I wanted to test it on that, or if you had a piece of crystal clay that you didn't use up, you can test it on that. But I just want to see how that's going to show up. And I think it might be actually a little bit too light. So I'm going to go ahead with my wet wipe and just kind of wipe that off. Put that aside for the next project. And now I know I need to add a tiny bit more of the blue, and I might already have it on here. Let me see. That might not be enough. So I'm going to flip this toothpick around and use the other side. Get a little bit more onto my toothpick. Put that in and see how we did. Now I'm really wanting it to be pale, pale, pale. So it's easiest just to keep on adding more colorant than it is to keep on adding more of this into here, because I'm not going to need that much of this unless I was doing a lot of pieces, which is often what I do. I'll have a lot of projects sitting here waiting to go before I'll even get to this state of mixing the colorants, but I think I want a little more blue. Now watch, I'll probably overdo it this time. A little more blue. I grab another toothpick. See, that's how fast it happens. But that might be what I need in order for this to show up nicely. Let's test it. And there we have it. That's a really nice colored blue on that piece. Alright, so the next step is we're going to colorize our crystal clay. For this next step, we're going to go ahead and put the colorized resin that we just mixed onto the crystal clay. I highly recommend that this be at least 2 hours cured before you do this next step. Alright, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer so you can see what I'm doing. I'm taking the resin and I scoop off that side edge, and then I'm going to drizzle it onto my crystal clay. I highly recommend it go slow. As you build confidence, you can speed it up and you'll get more confident in like how much resin to put on and such. But when you're first starting out, just go slow. It is so much easier go slow than it is to clean up an over pour. So this card is ideal for this because I can move this around and not have to agitate in any way the resin as I'm working with it. Alright, so once I have it all on my surface, I can come back in with a toothpick and I'm going to pull the resin all the way over to that side edge so I have a nice clean edge instead of resin being in some places and not in others. So the next step I'm going to do is I'm going to take this off a camera because I want to see if I have any air bubbles that are lodged in the resin, and I'm going to huff on it. And the hot air from my breath will make the air expand and the bubbles will dissipate. I'm going to do my second one, this one here, but I'm going to start over. And I'm going to mix another batch of resin. So I'll do this one fast so you guys can see it in action. Now I'll let these two cure. If you have any resin that has overflowed to the side, don't worry about it. In 6 to 12 hours in that soft cure state, you'll be able to clean the bezels up by bending back the resin. In fact, let's go ahead and make one of these overflow so that you can see later on which one we should do, pink or blue. Let's do blue. Because this one was a lot more sculpted, this will probably be more likely to overflow. So I just put a ton more on there, and I'm going to push it so you can see now that one of the edges is overflowed. Oops, bummer. And I'll show you in a little bit how you clean that up 6 to 12 hours from now, and that's in the soft cure state. Alright, so our piece is now fully cured. It's actually been longer than the 12-hour mark. I am fully cured at probably 24 hours right now, but let me just show you how you can go in here. You just grab the resin right at the side of the bezel right here, and you just bend it back, and this will peel back and away. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time to get it started. This actually went underneath the bezel too when I did that little overflow. So it just came right out of the looped area, and it looks like it's picking up a lot of my mica powder, that resin, because remember when I poured this on, my resin, my clay wasn't fully cured. So you have to go in here. This is the more tricky part. When I did my little, hey, let's go ahead and show you how you clean it up afterwards, I didn't think about this back part. I was just thinking about this side edge. So you can get an idea of how easy that was to clean up once we got it started. All right, and here's the other piece that we made together. Pretty fun, huh?